Connor Shep, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Rob, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's good to finally catch up virtually. Wrote an article for Sportsmith, I think, last year, which was in the top 10 most read articles on ISOs. So we'll dive into some of that stuff. And then another one coming down the line on hamstrings, so we'll dive into some of that stuff. But before we do, would you mind just giving us a bit of an intro to you, what you've been doing, what you now, what you've been doing in the past?
Yeah, so from America, been working in performance at the collegiate professional level now for about 9 years. Bounced around a little bit between American football and soccer. Currently in my role, I'm at Liberty University, where I'm the director of applied performance, and then I also oversee all performance for men's soccer, and then all return to play initiatives for all of our teams here.
So was that Ryan's role before?
No, so Ryan was specifically with football. He was the
Okay.
assistant, and then he oversaw all of those aspects of performance for just football, as to where I just oversee everything else for the rest of our sports, our soccers, basketballs, baseballs, things like that.
It's interesting because I've been doing this so long, I'm having people in the same role or the same role on the podcast, but it's the next person or the next person's next person. So it's, I've had a couple of them
Oh, it's
recently.
crazy, man.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. You obviously know how long you've been doing it, but man, I feel like I've been listening to the podcast since I was back in like undergrad, which is insane to think about now.
It's over 10 years.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
crazy.
just over 10 years, which is crazy. But like I mentioned, you'd written a storming article for Sportsmith on isometrics. And I don't know if you looked at the list of 10 most popular or most read articles on Sportsmith last year, but I think probably 4 out of the 10, maybe 3 out of the 10 were isometric related. And I think the majority of the others were speed related. Then there's a few anomalies in there as well. But so ISOs and speed are clearly what people care about. So let's have a little chat around them. And I was just saying beforehand, isometrics seem to get thrown in because people like to have a polarized opinion, and still people bring up ISOs of maybe and we'll come into this later on, that the Nordic debate. Oh, these are like the fad, like Nordics are, and whatever. So, just to get your opinion, isometrics. Why do you believe in them? And then we'll get into where you program and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I just, I came into this, I've always used isometrics a fair amount in my programming, a little bit more than most coaches, but I think like once I had specifically started working with soccer, I started to delve into it a little bit more. Obviously, like a lot of the things coming out of the performance world are, you know, overseas, you start to see a little bit more of that stuff pop up. Obviously, Alex Natera's work started to really drive some of that, and like conversations behind it and some of the popularity of it. And for me, I just always broke it down to like 3 kind of big rocks of why I use isometrics. One is like the motor learning aspect of the education, right? Like the more time we spend in a position, the more motor learning is going to take place, right? Like that's just kind of, it goes back to strength conditioning 101 of just like when we're talking about specificity and joint angles and regimes of muscular work and force production, like we can really isolate some of those things. And there's just so much motor learning that goes on, especially with like underdeveloped athletes. I think where we get lost in some of these like training models is we think that we're working with advanced athletes, but in reality, like their training age is really for most of these kids pretty so low. And the ability to just put them into a very specific position and spend a lot of time there. I think just from a motor learning aspect, motor control, man, I just think there's so much benefits that come from that. Not just in the training standpoint, but especially from a return to play standpoint, which I know we'll get into a little bit later on. And then next, just being like kind of already hit on, just the ability to isolate certain qualities, right? So like the thing that I love about isometrics is, they really can fit into any part of your programming throughout the year, right? Just because there's just so many different things that we can manipulate to target specific qualities, right? So if you run like a little bit more of like for example, a linear based model where we work on extensive qualities and then a little bit more force, strength driven qualities, and then to more dynamic effort qualities. Well, we can manipulate the isometrics to marry those stimuluses, right? Like we can, do extensive isometrics at a lower intensity to start to build tissue capacity, some metabolic adaptations, things like that. If we want to start to get into some more strength driven qualities, we start more overcoming some more high intensity 3 to 5 second grinding isometrics, right? And then if we're working more dynamic, then we can start to get into, some of the more rate dependent stuff of like, 1 to 2 second overcoming isometrics, or even switches, right? Switches, bounds, like whatever it is. We can really start to hone in on like specific qualities that we want to address. And I just think that just makes it such like an easy tool to apply across like the gambit of your whole programming philosophy. And then lastly, I just think that like, there's so much potentiation from it, and not potentiation maybe in the classical sense of like PAP, but just more so in the sense of like we get such a high stimulus at a relatively low cost, right? And I think like, the reason we've started to see that come up even more and more is the reality is like we work in a field where we like, it rarely is the strength coach the one calling the shots across everything, right? We have to answer to people, right? And like, we have to be able to find a way to develop athletes, get a huge stimulus without interfering with the sport, right? Like we always want to keep the main thing. And so our ability to like get these athletes in good positions, get them under high force outputs without taking away from what we're trying to do on the field, man, I've just found such a benefit from that, especially in your sports, like your field sports, like, your soccers, your rugbies, your lacrosses, your field hockeys, where they have such a high speed distance demand, and such an external loading demand that, trying to fill those buckets and still try to make time for development, just think is just so much value in it.
You can, just from my experience working in football and playing, I can see why that would be such a pull for a sports coach if you sold that to them the way you've just described there, how much that would resonate and kind of give me confidence that you're not going to kill the players. Because as you know, when you look to kind of European football, English football now, that's always a concern with the amount of games and the amount of, like you say, high intensity running demands. Isometrics just seems to, based on that description, fit into that model as well. Yeah. So, like I said before, this gets isometrics for whatever reason, might just be the people that pop them out on my Twitter feed. But why do you think there's still a section of the industry who think that this interest will just come and go, doesn't have any foundations, all the negative stuff that we see from pretty much anything that comes onto the scene?
Right. So, I've been working in, I guess, performance for just a little under a decade now. And like, there was a time in my career, Rob, where like, you'd see the, like, especially when you're younger, you'd see the old heads start to complain of like, oh, like we've been doing this since the 60s and like, oh, we're doing this, yada, yada, yada. And it was like, all right, like we get it, move on. Now I'm starting to get to the point where we do start to see these things kind of cycle back through, right? Like I think like the easy examples like, agilities, right? Like 20 years ago, it was all about change of direction and closed drills. And then there was this, phenomenon of like, oh, it's all about open, OODA loop and perception and reaction. And then we start to see like some of Damian Harper's work, and it's like, oh no, we got to go back to some of the D-cell stuff, right? And like, at no point were any of those people wrong. It's just more sort of the idea that it's all right? Like everything has a place in time. I guess for me, where it comes down to, and the thing that I love about isometrics is like, it's just a method. And as long as it, aligns with your principles, there isn't a wrong way of doing it, right? Like, I think that, if you don't feel like logistically you can do it, if you don't feel like it doesn't fit within your system, that's fine, right? Like, you could say the same thing about Olympic derivatives, right? Like, they're not inherently wrong. They just may not fit within what you do, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not a time and a place for it. And I think for a majority of sports, because of the bandwidth of what we're able to do from an isometric standpoint, I really think that they are a great tool for anyone in performance, just because of what we've already talked about before and the vast amount of benefits from it. Why people are starting to, shy away from it, I do think it's a little bit of just, there has been a little bit of I don't want to say overcorrection, but there's certainly been a drastic rise in popularity. And some of that's just not going to align with what people believe. I think people naturally are just going to have a lot of preconceived notions, and when things don't support their narrative, they're naturally going to want to shy away from it and pick at like why this wouldn't work or why it doesn't fit within their system, as opposed to saying, hey, I understand why this works. It just doesn't, operate within what I'm trying to do.
So you mentioned logistically doesn't work or may not work for people. What challenges did you face when trying to implement isometrics logistically, and how did you get over those issues?
Um, well, one, it's hard for me to speak. If anybody knows like the situation that I operate out of, I'm extremely fortunate. I work in one of the nicest facilities in the country. So super fortunate from that standpoint. I'd say the biggest challenge that I probably face is from trying to introduce some of these things are the time aspect of it, right? Like when we start to add in, especially some of these isometrics, we're just adding more work to the time that we already don't have, right? So, if anybody's worked in sport, you understand that, especially in collegiate athletics, there's times of the years where you have 8 hours, 4 of that goes to the sport, 4 of that goes to us. And then there's time when we go into 20 hours. But even from that standpoint, I'm not always getting the one that gets to pick the time of, hey, we're going to have 30, 40, 60 minutes here. There's days where, hey, I get the, hey, you got 20 minutes and then you got to be down in practice, right? And so, like, obviously, like, that's going to make things complicated. I would say from a logistics standpoint, one, identifying like, okay, like what are the big rocks that I want to hit on? All right. And then what is the quickest and easiest way that I can target those big rocks? So like for me, going back to some of Alex's stuff, hip, knee, and ankle. Okay. How can we make the time and preset the room to try to get the athletes in and out as fast as we can and still get a great stimulus out of it? I have a ton of help I have an unbelievable group of interns here that can help set those things up and can help coach our athletes through those things. But I think ultimately, like once I've been doing it long enough, probably the best thing that's come from it is just the fact that I have an older group now that has been around and doing it long enough that I pretty much just have to open the room and they kind of take care of it themselves. And, it's one of those things, like, especially when we have younger athletes coming in here, like, I'm getting some academy based kids that are 17, 18 years old and leaving home for the first time that have never stepped foot in a weight room. I have a group of guys that I can lean on pretty well to kind of carry that torch for me and kind of show them a way, and really just kind of run the room themselves. And I just kind of get to sit back and watch and, step in when needed.
Nice. Sounds like a good place to be. Need to see the pictures of that weight room, by the way. I've seen the videos from the article, but definitely need some pictures.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned in the article, and this is, I don't know if this has changed since then, but acceleration day, max speed day, multi-directional day. Where do ISOs fit into those three buckets?
Yeah, so I think, it depends about the time of the year. Depends on the qualities that we're trying to train. So if we are in the off season, that's generally the way that I'll try to delineate things, right? So we'll do all of our dynamic workout on the field or our speed work or, movement prep before training, right? So I identify like, okay, like what are the big rocks and the qualities that I want to work on that day, right? So an acceleration day, a max velocity or a top end speed day or upright running, whatever you want to call it, and then a multi-directional base day, right? And I'll just generally anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes of movement prep before training. And then my goal is, okay, like how can I marry those stimuluses, what we did out there on the field, to what we're doing in the weight room? So inherently, if we're working on acceleration, let's start to look at some of the qualities of, okay, we're going to be in deeper joint ankles, right? It's going to be very hip driven, right? It's going to be much more influenced by strength. So we'll probably be working on some more grinding isometrics and things like that. Deeper flexion at the knee, deeper flexion at the ankle. And that will be our movement prep before we head into the rest of our more like traditional strength training, right? Or it'll be worked in as a superset, depending upon the time of the year. The only real caveat to that is if we're doing like extensive isometrics, we'll always do those things at the end. But anything outside of that, we'll do that at the beginning of the lift as soon as they come in. The max velocity days or our upright days, we'll do much shallower angles. So, 10-degree knee bend, plantar flex work, things of that nature, more dynamic effort. So we maybe, shorten the duration of the isometrics, a little bit more dynamic efforts of, 2-second max efforts as opposed to, grinding strength at 75 to 90% maximal voluntary contraction. And then multi-directional day, we're just going to try to, again, mimic the same movement patterns that we're doing on the field. So we'll do some sort of lateral isometric where we're pushing up against a wall, pairing that with some sort of dynamic effort work in here of like a lateral jump or a lateral throw. and just trying to target a little bit more of that frontal plane of movement and matching it up with what we're trying to do out on the field.
Sorry, I'm furiously writing here. So the frontal plane stuff that you mentioned there, I mean, for the more sagittal plane stuff, working with force plates, you can get an idea, you can get the data. Is that something that you do? So testing and training and testing to understand the
more
effort that
sagittal
you're.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To understand. Yeah. Sorry, to understand the the percentage of